We have a extremely special treat today. Obviously, we are here to see writer-director Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 70 millimeter with Dolby 7.1 sound, the way God intended. And if that were not enough, we also have with us the man who created the special effects for the film, Mr. Douglas Trumbull. Mr. Trumbull, if you're not aware, is a 3-time competitive Oscar nominee. He has 2 Oscars, one for his development of the CP65 show scan camera, and also the Gordon Soy Award for his advancement of technology in the medium. He has also created special effects for 2001, The Andromeda Strain, Close Encounters, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Blade Runner, and Tree of Life. Which is, we can stop right there. He also helped advance IMAX into a public offering. And if you've ever been on a simulator ride and enjoyed those across any theme park, he really was the pioneer for that concept. Kind of bringing that to fruition with the Back to the Future ride at Universal Studios. And he is continuing to push the medium forward with UFO which is a 10-minute short that is showing tomorrow at 12:33 and 5:30. I believe that was correct. And it's at 120 FPS, frames per second. It is in 3D and 4K, and it is a stunning experience. It is kind of like watching, you're in Paris in 1896 and you're watching the train come in and the Lumières are projecting it on the screen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Douglas Trumbull. Thank you. Thank you. Should we sit or stand?
You? Yeah. Oh, sit's good. I have to. This is 35 millimeter. I just found out.
What?
Yeah.
That's still okay. Because it's still Close Encounters. And could you give us all a little background into how you were brought into doing Close Encounters?
Well, it's a little bit complicated, but I had already started my company at Paramount called Future General Corporation, which was doing advanced research and development of new entertainment technologies, one of which was show scan that you mentioned, and the simulation technology and all kinds of other stuff. But while I was there, and I was getting particularly focused on my show scan process, which was 65 millimeter negative, 70 millimeter print, 60 frame per second process, I needed to round up a lot of 65 millimeter cameras. And the only way you get stuff like that is to hide it in the budget of somebody else's movie. So I agreed to do Close Encounters. Stephen asked me if I would do it. I had previously been, just shortly before that, been asked by George Lucas to do Star Wars. And I said, well, no, I'm not. I'm a director now. I don't do special effects, really. And I was trying to do development deals in Hollywood, and I found out that it was kind of badly confusing situation for a young guy to find out that you can't really make a movie as easily as I thought it was. And I had this contract with Paramount, we're doing all this R&D, and they didn't get it either. They had no idea what I was doing, they didn't understand it, they didn't want to do it. And when Spielberg asked, and this was right on the tail of Jaws, and I thought, well, this is probably one of the most interesting filmmakers I could ever possibly collude with. And so we met. I liked him very much, and what he wanted to do was very much more of interest to me than Star Wars had been. But he also agreed, without any reluctance whatsoever, to do all the visual effects for Close Encounters in 65 millimeter. So I got my cameras, and my optical printers, and all my goodies. And we were able to develop a lot of new technologies on this movie. Motion control, which is digitally controlling the movement of the camera so you can match them exactly. And it was the first time anybody had ever made a digital motion control system that we took on location in Mobile, Alabama, where we shot this movie in a big aircraft hangar down there. So we could actually record the movement of the camera during the shot that we would then subsequently add the mothership or the UFOs to. So it was the first time in movies that you could actually add digital motion to a camera, record it perfectly, play it back at 1 frame at a second, and add the UFOs and match the motion. It's a little confusing.
And actually, your crew at General, what happened to them?
My future general crew went on to do Star Wars,
Including,
including my own father and my best friend, John Dykstra, who had done silent running with me. I wasn't really ready to continue doing special effects services, so by the time I was ready to do Close Encounters, everybody was already gone to George. So we had to round up a whole new team of people, which turned out just fine. It was great.
something fascinating, your father, although he was an engineer, I believe,
Yes.
when you were in your, when you were growing up, had also done some special effects himself.
Well, before I was born, my father worked on The Wizard of Oz. And he was a very young guy. He was a mechanical engineering type, and he was what you would call a kind of an effects rigger. So he was part of the team rigging the wire rigs for the flying monkeys and the wire rigs for the tree grabbing the apples. And for his most personal job was using a fishing pole and monofilament line to move the lion's tail around. So there he was. But
See, I didn't know. That's
well,
fantastic.
when I was born, that was all gone, and my father had moved on to the aircraft industry. And so all through my life, movies were not present as a thing. I kind of found out inadvertently that my dad had worked on The Wizard of Oz and a number of other movies. But it really wasn't present in my life that my dad was going to a movie studio every day, because that was not the case. I brought him back into the industry on Silent Running, yes.
Yeah. Well, just had, before we start, what were some early influences? You know, films weren't necessarily in your, you know, as part of the industry you were in, obviously. What were some early influences? Because I know that when you were really discovered by Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick for
2001.
For Moon.
They saw To the Moon and Beyond.
Yeah, they saw To the Moon and Beyond and hired you for 2001. That you were, you know, kind of a graphic artist. You had a suitcase of aliens and
Yeah.
UFO. Where did that come from? Do you think?
It just came from reading science fiction. That was my avocation during high school. I hated every minute of high school, but believe me, I loved every minute of reading science fiction. Going to the library and getting Heinlein and Arthur Clarke and all the great science fiction writers. I was reading all that stuff. So my head was locked in other planets and other civilizations far, far away. And so when I started becoming an artist, which wasn't until I left high school, my portfolio started filling up with alien planets and spacecraft, which is what got me my job at Graphic Films.
So, as we watch Close Encounters, what are some things we should look for?
There's several interesting things. You will see camera motion during composite shots. I don't know if that means anything to anybody, but that was unique to not have to lock off the camera and have the camera fixed while something is being added to a shot. There are a lot of shots like that in the movie, but there are some shots where the camera's actually moving. The cloud effect was one of the most fun things we ever did. And it kind of came from some messing around I was doing back on 2001, which starts by putting cream in a cup of coffee. And you realize, oh, it kind of looks like little miniature clouds. And it looks particularly good on espresso, I found out. So we had this idea, because Spielberg wanted the UFOs to come out of clouds. No one had any idea how to do that or what we were going to do, but that was a requirement. And so we got some small aquariums, little fish tanks at the store, the pet store, various kinds of paints and dyes, and actually settled on half and half and milk. It's just like the greatest thing. It's organic, it's got a really nice filamental look to it, it distributes nicely. And then Scott Squires, who I had hired as a young artist, I think he originally came from somewhere in the Midwest, had this really clever idea. He's been, if you ever look up Scott Squires, you'll see his name on IMDb all over the place, because he's been really, has had a great career in special effects. He said, what if we filled a tank half full of salt water and then filled the rest of it with fresh water, so there's a specific gravity boundary layer between the top and the bottom, which would be like an inversion layer in the atmosphere. And I said, that sounds like a profoundly excellent idea. And we tried it in a little aquarium, and it worked. And we found the bottom half with salt water, make really dense salt. You add a lot of salt to the water until it's really saturated, and so it's saltier than the ocean, which means it's denser and heavier. Put a little thin layer of polyethylene sheeting. Very carefully fill the rest with warm fresh water, and then pull the sheeting out. And those two kinds of specific gravities of water will remain separated for quite a long time. And if the camera is, if you look right on the edge of it, you'll see this boundary layer that looks like a lensing effect, looks like a mirage. But if you get just a little off axis, we found that you could inject paint into the fresh water, and it would start to spread, but it would also start to fall until it hit this boundary layer, and then spread out with flat bottoms, which is what you see with clouds all the time, is flat bottom clouds, because they're hitting a layer of the atmosphere. And that was what made it look real. And then I had to figure out how to make the clouds come out of nowhere and kind of appear right on camera. And I remembered a manipulator arm that had been used in the making of the Andromeda strain in the hot rooms. In the hot rooms in an atomic energy facility, the operators can't be anywhere in proximity to high camera. And so that's how that was done. And you'll see, we're going to run a little slideshow while we talk later. And you'll spot some of those shots of the tank rig coming up with this big manipulator arm in it. And it was really one of the most fun things ever. And we started exploring various kinds of lights that we could poke into the tank on rods and make lights come through the clouds, and then join that up with a little UFO appearing from the bottom of the cloud, things like that. So it was that kind of thing that's part of what I love about movies, is that what I call organic effects. I've always resisted computer graphics because I just don't like spending my life at a computer terminal. And I always find that organic effects have some surprising element to them that you can't design, you can't expect, and you'll be wonderfully satisfied that something's going to happen that is better than what you imagined. So we do that to this day, and in tomorrow's screening of UFOTOG, we have a lot of organic effects, including tank shots, like Close Encounters, only like much more complicated, much more lit carefully, and much more interesting phenomena, all shot at 120 frames in 3D 4K. So it's another animal already. So the mothership is another really cool example of where we had a lot of fun, because in the making of Close Encounters, one of my thoughts was that to make a miniature look big, you have to, and this was all going to take place at night, or almost all of it at night. So I said, well, let's make a false atmosphere that's 10, if we want a 1/10 scale miniature to look 10 times bigger, you have to make the atmosphere 10 times more dense. So we built a smoke room. And it was just a really big black plywood room with black velvet inside and fans that stirred up the air. And we had a smoke machine that injected smoke into the room. We had a little laser beam across the ceiling of the room to measure the density of the smoke in a little box, so that we could just say, well, give me a smoke density of 8. And just until you got there, you'd say, look at it, well, I need a little more, let's go to 10 or go to 12 or whatever, that were only an inch in diameter, looked like skyscrapers that were 1,000 feet tall. And that's what set the scale, is the smoke and the light sets the scale.
And speaking of the mothership, we were talking about this earlier, and our apologies to anyone who hasn't seen Close Encounters. At the end, well, there's a ship, and there are things on that ship. Spoilers, sorry about that. And there are things on that ship which I always doubted until you confirmed for me.
Okay, I'll tell you one more story before we start the movie, because we got to move on. When we're making the movie, I'm still kind of a young, budding filmmaker. I'm just kind of watching Steven Spielberg, which was kind of an amazing experience for a young filmmaker to watch a master filmmaker like Spielberg at work. And Steven's name was on the screenplay. He wrote the screenplay. He had some help from 4 or 5 other friends who are kind of uncredited, but if you go on IMDb, you'll have them credited. So he collaborated with other people. And one of the characters in the movie is a French UFO researcher named Lacombe, played by Francois Truffaut. I thought, well, this is really cool. Francois Truffaut, the famous French filmmaker, who also came to watch Spielberg. He was fascinated with this enfant terrible American filmmaker, and he wanted to watch his work, so he agreed to do this role. Many years later, and I didn't think much of it, you know, we were there, we made a movie, it's done. Fictional movie about aliens coming and a mothership landing and all this stuff. And a friend of mine who worked for me much later on the Luxor Hotel attractions, Joel Hynek, was the son of J. Allen Hynek. And J. Allen Hynek was one of the greatest UFO researchers of all time, who defected from the government and said, you can't cover this up, this is too amazing and real. And I called Joel, I said, who is this character that they're talking about in Close Encounters, this French guy? And he says, that's Jacques Vallée. I said, well, can you put me in touch with Jacques Vallée? Because I was really interested in UFOs. And so he gave me Jacques' phone number. And the story, to make it short, is that Jacques Vallée, when he was 11 years old, living in a suburb of Paris, saw a UFO land in a field outside his house. And it was corroborated by a friend, neighbor of his, another young boy, 2 or 3 houses away. So it wasn't some nightmare, hallucination, or whatever. He actually saw a UFO. It transformed his life. He started writing about it, researching it, and became the UFO researcher writing about UFOs. And so he's writing these books, and completely uncredited, Steven Spielberg is lifting Jacques Vallée's books to write Close Encounters. So I called Jacques, I said, Jacques, wait a minute. So there are abductions, people are getting abducted and taken up into Alpha Centauri? He said, oh yes, absolutely. So I only suggest that you open your mind a little bit. The UFO question is really fun. You can be run out of town. If you're an academic, don't mention the name. But I've been very involved in this world of UFOs. I'm fascinated with it. You'll see a UFO tomorrow pretty much entering into this theater in 3D. So I'm kind of morbidly fascinated with the whole thing. So when you look at this movie today, think about it in the terms that maybe part of it is true. Maybe all of it is true. It's a fictional science fiction entertainment movie, but maybe this stuff actually happened.
And with that, I think we'll get on to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You'll be joining us
Yeah,
again.
I'll be back when the movie's over and we'll talk, do some Q&A. And then while we do the Q&A with you, ask any questions you want. We're gonna run some slides of just behind the scenes photographs of the movie in production, so you can see some of the stuff. That might spur some questions as well.
Let's
Okay?
watch the movie.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, guys.